Clifford Donahue had been working with the Highway Patrol for 3 months now, but he didn't manage to accomplish anything special yet. The young, ambitious man read books by Rex Stout and imagined himself as a great detective. Unfortunately, things never went beyond his dreams. During his service, Clifford didn't yet get to detain any dangerous criminals, but what he did manage to accomplish was to become the laughingstock of the precinct, since the other officers found his deduction skills rather amusing. Just look at this Pinkerton. You just can't help but laugh at him. He's not a cop, and he won't ever be, they kept saying, hinting at his frail physique. Clifford could feel the hostility emanating from the other officers and their superiors, but he didn't show it and simply did his job so that one day he could be proud of himself. With that in mind, Clifford never allowed himself to relax while on duty and remained vigilant at all hours of the day. And that day, he was standing at his post and carefully studying the vehicles passing by. There were many trucks, pickups, and minivans going by, making Clifford feel like there would be no end to them. Basically, the young police officer was supposed to make sure that no one went over the speed limit on the section of the route entrusted to him. Sometimes he stopped suspicious vehicles to inspect them. His colleagues only laughed at him, never ceasing to be surprised by his zeal. A week ago, Clifford stopped his strange pickup truck, which was filled with plastic containers. When the police officer asked the driver about the content of the containers, the man said something unintelligible, which only made the officer more suspicious. Having sensed danger, Clifford called for reinforcements, much to the amusement of the dispatcher. When backup arrived at the scene, the young officer was holding the owner of the pickup truck at gunpoint and demanding that he open the containers. Clifford's rich imagination had already come up with various possibilities, such as illegally mined diamonds, gold, or something smuggled from the countries of Latin America. Since the driver refused to open the containers, the police officer did it himself. Imagine Clifford's surprise when he saw dozens of snakes inside the containers. Apparently, the driver loved these reptiles and caught them to start a private herbarium. Poor Clifford got scared and instinctively recoiled, which caused an outburst of laughter from his colleagues. As it turned out, the Ford driver didn't do anything illegal, and therefore the other officers got yet another reason to make fun of Clifford. All the men could do was accept the facts and let the ill-fated snake lover leave in peace. After that incident, Clifford got the reputation of a hopeless loser and a failure of a detective. Of course, this attitude made the man feel extremely uncomfortable, but there was nothing he could do to change the situation for the better. Despite the unfortunate incident with the containers, Clifford remained just as vigilant and meticulous as he was before. Therefore, when the officer saw a black Cadillac on the road, his heart began to beat anxiously. For some inexplicable reason, this car seemed strange to him. The first thing that made Clifford suspicious was the fact that the Cadillac was clearly used as a hearse. This was evidenced by the characteristic curtains on the windows and the mournful black color of the car. Having gotten out of the patrol car, Clifford gave the Cadillac a signal to pull over. "Good afternoon, sir. Did I do something wrong? Just give me a ticket if I did," the driver said immediately, barely having opened the door. Clifford nodded and introduced himself. The officer tried to ignore the driver's obvious behavior. He was acting like a cat that ate his master's dinner and was now trying to evade responsibility. The owner of the Cadillac looked very strange. His close-set eyes followed Clifford's every move, as if there was something he didn't want the officer to find. "What are you transporting?" Clifford asked while checking the license plate of the car. "Sir, what do you think a hearse could be transporting? It's a coffin, of course. I need to bring it to the cemetery, and they'll deal with it there," the driver answered immediately. Clifford thought for a second. The driver's explanation seemed quite plausible, but there was one inconsistency. If he's taking it to the cemetery, then why is he alone? Where is the funeral procession? Didn't the deceased have any relatives? The officer thought. "So what, officer? Can I go? They're probably waiting for me there already," the driver said. Clifford tensed up visibly. His intuition was telling him that something was definitely off with the situation. However, remembering the incident with the ill-fated containers, Clifford was afraid to make yet another mistake and being ridiculed by his colleagues yet again. Therefore, he didn't call for backup and decided to deal with the situation on his own. "The coffin, you say? Can I see what's inside?" Clifford asked, giving the driver his documents back. The owner of the Cadillac tensed up, visibly. Then he pulled himself together and answered cautiously. "Of course you can, but why would you want to? There's just nothing to see there, just some alcoholic man. It doesn't look pretty, to be honest." But Clifford ignored the driver's advice and opened the back door of the Cadillac. There really was a coffin inside. It looked like one of the cheaper options. Having carefully opened the lid, Clifford looked inside. At that moment, the officer expected to see anything but what he actually did. Clifford's imagination was already painting pictures of him arresting the smuggler who was using the coffin to transport weapons and jewelry. Moreover, the man's mind was already seeing his own photo in the local newspaper, covering the story of how he bravely detained the dangerous criminal. He was already seeing himself in the spotlight, under the flashes of countless cameras, giving out interviews. In his mind, he was already basking in the rays of glory. However, it all turned out to be just a dream, yet again, which got dispelled as soon as Clifford opened the coffin. To the great disappointment of the police officer, there really was a dead man inside. Or rather, a dead woman, an elderly woman of about 70. Her skin seemed unnaturally ruddy, as if she'd died an hour ago or so. At first glance, it didn't look all that strange. But then Clifford realized that the driver had deliberately lied to him. But he said it was an alcoholic man, when in fact it's an old woman. What's going on here? Is it an honest mistake, or did he deliberately lie to me? Clifford thought. All this seemed very strange to the police officer. To be frank, this was the first time Clifford had seen such a funeral procession. Usually there were at least 3 cars in the procession, but there was just this one Cadillac. And the driver was rather strange, with his shifty eyes and an extremely unpleasant demeanor. Clifford knew that he could be wrong, but he could feel that something was off, and therefore he couldn't let the driver go. Pushing the lid of the coffin aside, the police officer gently touched the hand of the deceased woman and shuddered. "Dear Lord, she's warm." Clifford didn't get to continue his train of thought. At that very moment, the driver hit him on the head with a tire iron. Clifford's mind went dark and he lost all consciousness. Since the section of the road was relatively deserted, the attacker quickly pushed the unconscious police officer into the car and slammed the door. Poor Clifford now had to lie next to a coffin with the elderly woman he didn't know, but who was probably alive. The driver looked around and then quickly jumped into the car and stepped on the gas, rushing towards the city cemetery. It took Clifford some time to regain consciousness. The blow with the tire iron was so strong that it gave the police officer a concussion. The man was feeling terrible weakness throughout his body. The officer felt that he was floating on waves of pain, emerging from under them once in a while to take a breath of fresh air and then plunging back into the abyss of suffering. Clifford wasn't even sure if he was alive or if he had already made the transition to another world. But the fact that the Cadillac was still on the move made Clifford believe that he was still alive after all. As he teetered on the brink of consciousness, his body felt the characteristic jolts of driving on a dirt road. "Is he really taking me to the cemetery?" flashed through the officer's mind. Clifford's intuition didn't fail him. Soon the car reached the city cemetery, the realm of the dead. Since Clifford was still very weak, he couldn't actively resist the attacker. Moreover, the driver had taken Clifford's service weapon. Meanwhile, the driver got out of the car and checked the grave that had already been dug up. The driver's name was Tony Ramirez. He was a hardened criminal. The old woman lying in the coffin definitely wasn't dead, but simply stuffed with sleeping pills. It was a criminal group of realtors who drugged the old woman. They wanted to get their hands on her house in the suburbs. They were running a smart and rather simple scam. They targeted lonely, elderly homeowners by getting into their good graces and then getting rid of them. Since they didn't want to get any real blood on their hands, they came up with a rather ingenious way to get rid of their bodies. Clifford pretended to be dead and watched the man pull the coffin out of the car and pushed it into the grave. Now, all that was left for the driver to do was fill the grave with earth and rejoice at the fact that another unfortunate woman fell victim to their scam. But at that point, the driver started hesitating for some reason. At first, Clifford didn't understand why the man paused, but when he started dragging Clifford out of the car, the officer realized what the man's plan was. "Dear Lord, he wants to bury me alive next to the unfortunate old woman." The man started to panic. Clifford didn't want to die, and therefore he gathered the last of his strength and kicked the driver in the chest with his feet. The driver didn't expect that, so much so that he lost his balance and, having stumbled on the edge of the grave, fell down. The fall was so unexpected and awkward that the man broke his ankle on the wooden coffin lid. Meanwhile, Clifford headed for the gatehouse, staggering from the dizziness and nausea that were washing over him. Desperately waving his hands, the officer tried to attract the attention of any visitors who could be at the cemetery at that time. Soon, the cemetery caretaker noticed the man and immediately called an ambulance and the police. Nothing of the kind had ever happened in their city before, or in their state for that matter. The story was so shocking that it got immediately picked up by the local media, which covered it from every perspective possible. As it turned out later, thanks to Clifford's vigilance, an entire criminal ring was uncovered. It consisted of several people, including the driver, Tony Ramirez. It was Tony who almost buried Clifford and the unfortunate woman alive. To the surprise of her doctors, the unfortunate incident didn't seem to have any effect on the old woman's health. Moreover, having come to her senses, Amanda Bronson said, "I haven't slept so soundly in a very long time, but I did have the strangest dream." Clifford looked at his colleagues and shook his bandaged head. For the first time in his life, he managed to help detain a real criminal. After this incident, they stopped making fun of Clifford at the precinct. He even got a promotion. Now, his colleagues no longer talk about the incident with the containers, but only about the time Clifford risked his life to neutralize a member of the Black Realtors gang. Clifford started visiting Mrs. Bronson in his free time, and the old woman always treated him to some tea and homemade pastries. The old woman knew that it was thanks to Clifford that she didn't get buried alive and got to continue living her life in her own home. Soon, the story about Clifford's courage spread beyond the state lines. The story of the Black Realtors got twisted and acquired many details that were never actually part of the original events. But Clifford didn't care about any of that and continued to stand on guard of the law, just as he did before. Next time you drive down a highway, it could well be Clifford who will wave at you from the patrol car. But there's no way for you to know for sure.